On March 22nd, the Russian army had reached the gates of Kiev and was advancing steadily throughout eastern and southern Ukraine. The outcome that many had predicted and feared appeared inevitable, that Russia would swallow Ukraine whole in a matter of weeks. However, by the end of April, Russian forces would retreat from Kiev and would retreat from other parts of northern Ukraine, and by the end of the year, Russia would be pushed out of Sumy and Kharkiv oblasts and parts of Kherson. These humiliating defeats would shock the world and allow Ukraine to continue into the war up to today, but how exactly did they happen? Well, there's a number of reasons why. And one of the most telling is logistics. I dug into what Russia's pre-war logistics were supposed to look like before the war and what their strengths and weaknesses were, as well as why they fell so short in Ukraine. And let's go ahead and find that out together. Russian logistics forces are organized under what's called the MTO, or the Materialno-Techniskoye Obespechenie. This organization is heavily centralized and reports directly to the Deputy Minister of Defense. Overall, the MTO is small compared to Russia's combat forces. This small size can be best summed up with a ratio of 1 sustainer to every 4 combat personnel. And to contextualize just how small that is, in the United States, there are around 5 sustainers for every 1 combat person, meaning that on average, 1 sustainer has to cover all the needs from food, fuel, ammo, repair equipment, medical care, transportation, and more for 4 combat personnel. Whereas in the United States, there are 5 support personnel to handle all of those needs for every 1 combat troop. More support staff means that combat troops get what they need faster, in the right quantity and in the right location, with less delays or errors. And this is absolutely critical in high-intensity, large-scale combat operations. The MTO is also designed to be filled largely with conscripts, and this becomes very important very quickly. This means that the organizations and the units themselves are there, but they're lightly manned with professional troops, but they're really designed to be filled up with conscripts as soon as, like, say, a mobilization were to happen. And that would balloon these forces up to what they are doctrinally supposed to be, which is still incredibly small, but still, their active duty component is even much smaller. However, there's an important legal fact about conscript troops, at least there was before the war. That is that they cannot legally fight outside the borders of Russia unless in the case of war. Outside of that, these large formations are often understaffed until the conscripts can fall in on the equipment and get to work. This is going to be an incredibly important detail for later. The MTO uses what's called a push system to get sustainment to combat units, meaning that the sustainment unit pushes predetermined amount of resources to the line unit. And this is based on a predetermined consumption rate determined during the planning phase. This, of course, contrasts again with the United States pull system, which the pull system is more decentralized. It operates similar to how Amazon works. So the line, in this case, the line unit would make an order of resources and things that it needs, be it, a certain amount of ammo, a certain amount of food, a certain amount of fuel. And then the sustainment unit pushes that quantity to a meeting point where they meet with the line unit, and the line unit goes and retrieves it. The MTO, by contrast, moves a predetermined amount of supply to the line unit directly. This can lead to overstockages or undersupply in warehouses and depots if estimates were off. And these overestimates or underestimates can leave combat units without the ammunition, food, or fuel that they'll need in high-intensity operations where they're consuming a lot of these things very quickly. The MTO is designed to operate with rail as its primary mover. Reforms within both the Russian MTO and the Duma have driven enhanced capability for all-terrain transportation support. The aerospace forces, for example, have undergone reforms that should be completed in 2025. However, I haven't been able to see just how much the war in Ukraine has impacted these reforms. So I would imagine that 2025, that's probably going to be a little bit later than expected. The MTO is largely designed to operate using fixed infrastructure, rail being a big one, but fuel pipes being another one. This can lead to incredibly high throughput when fighting is near these assets. However, it can take a while and be costly to establish when outside of Russia. This is why the United States operates largely from wheeled vehicles for unit sustainment. This offers both speed and flexibility. The MTO troops trained frequently prior to the war. Over 300 exercises involved MTO troops in 2020, with over 1,000 in 2021. And these exercises appear to be fairly decent. They appear to be designed for real-world scenarios, namely fighting against illegal armed groups in a strategic context. There were some issues that the MTO identified, though, during these exercises, including inadequate repair equipment and specialized fuel trucks, inadequate weapons to repel an attack, and inadequate communications with the commander. Now, these are some pretty important issues to bring up, especially as late as 2020 or 2021. Consider how long it might take to enact the reforms to change unit structure to make sure that they have, like let's say doctrinally, each unit will have the amount of weapons that they need to repel an attack. They have the processes in place to communicate with the commander, and they've got the repair equipment and fuel vehicles. I mean, this can be very expensive. It can be very time consuming to get to that point, so that they were being identified in as early as 2017 and as late as 2019. That's a tight turnaround whenever we remember that the war in Ukraine kicked off in 2022. So it's unclear exactly how many of these things they were able to address prior to the war. And these issues weren't just noticed by people operating within the MTO and during these exercises. These were also caught by both Western and Russian military analysts that had been studying the Russian MTO. The shortfalls weren't just in the size of the force itself, they were down to its basic functions. Resource inefficiency, both within the military and the defense industrial base, were a significant concern. Inadequate warehousing, also a very huge concern, especially with a push system. And this was even worse specifically for warehousing food and repair parts. These concerns also included unsuccessful or incomplete reforms, which included attempts to outsource certain functions to civilian contractors. The aerospace forces, for example, which had been undergoing some reforms years prior to the conflict, years before the war in Ukraine, they've continued to have some issues that have been absolutely acute in the war. Inadequate or no protective shelters for aircraft, for example, has made a very prominent feature with recent Ukrainian strikes on Russian airfields, especially in Crimea. Inadequate security at air bases kind of ties into this, and poor basic repair capabilities is another significant factor. And corruption plays a large part in all of this before the war. Even during the war, corruption plays a pretty significant role. All of this basically means that Russian logistics forces were highly capable when Russian troops were operating close to rail or close to pipeline infrastructure. For example, defensive operations in or near their own borders, where they could build their own infrastructure or where they already had their own infrastructure developed, that is where they should be pretty effective. However, the further they get from rail and the further they get from oil pipelines, and this is especially true in expeditionary roles, the more that they're going to struggle. Now, there are two recent case studies from before the war where they were able to successfully deploy and maintain forces abroad in an expeditionary capacity. One was in Syria and the other was in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, in both of these cases, the deployed forces were relatively small, and they did not have to deal with active combat operations against a near-peer adversary. They did, however, give Russia the opportunity to get some experience prior to Ukraine, basically exercising every military branch's logistical capabilities. For example, air and sea logistics in Syria and ground-based logistics in Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, with all the issues that we've identified, whenever Russia began its invasion in 2022 in Ukraine, the results were fairly predictable. In fact, rereading Alex Vershinin's article on War on the Rocks from 2021 basically spells out exactly how the early phase of the war went. As Alex pointed out, Russia's military lacked the sustainment forces necessary to maintain high-intensity combat operations outside of Russia's border. In the case of a land grab or large-scale invasion, Russia may reach its initial objectives quickly. However, it would have to make operational pauses to reset its logistics network prior to resuming. Russia reached the outskirts of Kiev very quickly at the outset of the war. They were also able to surround the city of Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other key areas within Ukraine. However, once they reached Kiev and they were unable to break in quickly, and the war began to go from weeks to potentially a month, they began to face significant challenges in sustainment. Their forces in Sumy weren't able to pause because they had to move hundreds of miles west to reach Kiev and offer support, while its logistics forces behind them were being ambushed and destroyed by Ukrainian forces. Again, this reflects the lack of organic security elements in every logistics unit prior to the war. Supply convoys often found themselves isolated against Ukrainian ambushes and basically getting annihilated, and that created significant challenges for the combat forces operating well ahead of the logistics forces. Instead of pushing through ambushes and communicating with higher echelons to organize air support or other forms of support against the ambushing Ukrainian forces, they were unprepared and completely destroyed. After weeks of fighting far from where they had successfully established rail connections with Russia, they had to abandon Kiev and withdraw the push from Sumy. While railhead operations could not be established in the north, they were established in the south from Crimea. and that's why Russia's advances from the south were pretty successful. The supply issues in Sumy Oblast, for example, led to large amounts of armored columns being abandoned because they ran out of fuel. In fact, up to 1/3 of the tanks used by Russia's 4th Tank Division were abandoned due to fuel shortages. Early in the war, Russia was Ukraine's largest donor of military aid, and this was simply because the MTO was not prepared or in many cases set up for failure for the war in Ukraine. Another key issue here is the MTO's reliance on conscripts. You might remember how I said that conscripts cannot legally be used outside of Russian borders unless a war is declared. Well, Putin was very careful in his initial speech to basically calling for the operation in Ukraine to call it just that, a special military operation and not a war. So conscripts legally could not partake in the festivities. Russia also delayed its first round of mobilization until 5 months into the war, long after the Kiev and Sumy pushes were abandoned. And this meant that the MTO forces operating in Ukraine would remain understaffed and small. This heavily impacted contract personnel who bore the brunt of attrition in the beginning phases of the war. And while all of these issues might have come as a shock to the world, it certainly was not a shock to anyone that was aware of these challenges or was aware of Russian logistics. Instead, it was just a completely predictable outcome. Now, that was the beginning of the war, but the war's been going on for a little over 2 years now. And what has happened since, and how has Russia adapted to the current situation? The MTO appears to have largely followed its combat forces' change in tempo and style. Mobilizations and Russian annexation of occupied Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia allows the MTO to use conscripts in those areas. This greatly enhances capability, but they're still well below the organic capability that's necessary to sustain their combat forces operating on the front line. They are, however, fighting closer to areas of strength, areas that they have rail connections and pipelines. Rail lines have been laid in some areas of Ukraine with connections to Russia that allows them to rapidly resupply combat elements from Russia. The bottleneck now appears to be just simply hauling that equipment from the railhead to the combat unit. Rail lines from Crimea to Donetsk via Kherson and Zaporizhia decrease the risk of Ukrainian strikes on the Kerch Strait Bridge. They also diversify routes getting supply forward and back. The proximity of Luhansk and Kharkiv to Russian logistics points in Belgorod and Rostov also make it easier to keep forward elements sustained. Additionally, slow, grinding, and attritional offensives like what we've seen Russia have basically since its breakdown in Kiev, that inherently prevents a breakthrough that would outrun its supply chain. The introduction and effective use of long-range fires by Ukraine has been a huge challenge for Russia, though. ATACMS, Storm Shadow, drones, and more force Russia to disperse logistics assets over wider areas to avoid becoming a target. And of course, this slows the rate of resupply for combat forces, and it disrupts the flow of supply and destroys vehicles supporting combat units. Today, Russia appears to be adapting to the threat. Neither side has successfully countered the drone threat, which can strike anywhere at any time. You cannot put EW everywhere. Russia has, however, begun to pivot to using UAZ-452 vans nicknamed loafs. They're small, cheap, and exist in high quantity. They're able to move personnel as well as low quantities of food, fuel, and ammo. They can backhaul wounded and dead personnel as well once the resupply has been dropped off. They are, however, relatively slow, incredibly weak, and pretty old. And their lifespan appears to be incredibly short, with some estimates showing that they'll have roughly 3 trips in them before they get destroyed. As such, there's a heavy demand to get even more of these to Russian sustainment units within Russia. This has driven the cost up for every loaf to roughly $15,000 or about 1.3 million rubles. And I saw this estimate, this transition to rubles. I did not believe that 15,000 US dollars was 1.3 million rubles. So I put it in a currency calculator, and that's completely real. That is true. It is 1.3 million rubles. And I guess inflation sucks whenever you start an illegal invasion. This appears to be one of Russia's favorite vehicles for sustainment at this moment. Bigger and heavier vehicles become a target, and the affordability allows Russia to get new loaves very quickly whenever they're lost. The downside, of course, is that they're still incredibly weak and there's not a lot of protection for the personnel inside. So whenever they're targeted, there's a high chance that the personnel inside might be killed or wounded and that the supplies might be lost. Now, in the near future, as the war continues, Russia may continue to face logistical challenges specifically whenever it comes to wheeled transportation. And this is a tale as old as time, a tale that they've struggled with since before the war. Limitations in wheeled transportation prevent exploitation and any kind of breakthrough in Ukrainian defenses. Even though they're making some grinding progress, we're probably not going to see Russia just, suddenly exploit a gap in the Ukrainian line and blitz to Kiev, because they lack the logistical capability to sustain that. And if they tried to do that, we probably see the same result as what we saw at the beginning of the war. And this is, of course, incredibly visible in the area around Avdiivka. There was one situation in recent months where two Ukrainian units were transitioning. One unit was moving back and the other was moving forward, so they were engaging in a unit handoff of the front line. Russia was able to exploit a failure in communication within that handoff where part of the front line was not manned, and they were able to push forward and take the town of Ocharynya. This caused a huge dilemma in Ukraine. Both the relieving unit and the relieved unit both had to go back to the front line to basically stabilize the situation and try to push the Russians back. They were unable to resecure the town, and Russia's been able to gain incremental progress ever since. However, Russia was unable to capitalize on that breakthrough and push deeper into the Ukrainian rear area because, again, they lack the logistical assets to sustain that. Now, with all this being said, none of this favors Russia in the long term. They're fighting on Ukraine's home turf. It'll be easier for Ukraine to sustain itself organically than it will be for Russia. The current rate of consumption of heavy equipment in Russia will put Russia in a challenging position within the next year or two, and tanks and IFVs are being destroyed at a rate higher than how they're being produced. And this is something that we've already discussed in another video that I'll link you to here in just a moment. Russia, of course, can choose to replace heavy equipment with purchased equipment from countries like Iran, North Korea, India, and China. However, we're just going to have to wait and see what they choose to do whenever the equipment problem really gets to a point that they have to make a decision. In either case, Russian logistics are far from ideal. From poor initial force structure to insufficient planning and the threat of drones and long-range fires, they find themselves facing challenges they frankly have never faced before in their history. And it's important for all militaries watching this conflict to take notes and recognize exactly how this happened so they don't make the same mistakes. Because this very well may be why Russia loses this war. Now, with all that, I want to hear your thoughts on this. Comment your thoughts about logistics, everything that we've talked about, what you think might be happening next. Leave a like on this video if you found this interesting and informative and to really help this channel grow. And subscribe to join the Nerd Army. As of the time that I'm recording this, we're at about 299 subscribers. Again, if we get to 500, then I'll be able to share updates and stuff on the community tab. That'll be a pretty big deal. And with all that, I'll see you all next time. Later.